There's all this really ugly history behind modern American tradition. Some of our people call this Thanksgiving Day.
I hate Thanksgiving, and if you love Thanksgiving, then fuck you, and you deserve to feel bad. Your excuses are bullshit too. Some people, though, may wonder why I don't hate the 4th of July as much as I hate Thanksgiving. Some people may even find my disdain for Thanksgiving to be disproportionate to my hatred of Christmas. Christmas and the 4th of July are both worth critiquing on their own right, being that 4th of July is based on a fake sense of drunken nationalist dribble, while Christmas being the economic center of capitalist exploitation wrapped in a bow. Thanksgiving, however, is completely different and arguably far worse than the other two. I hate that the culture that we live in specifically tries to make Thanksgiving innocent, and that's repulsive. We're diving into a culture of erasure, a culture that champions itself on a drunken narrative of innocence, an unwarranted and absolutely unfounded moral grounds protected from scrutiny through coercion and colonial violence, and a disingenuously foul stink of lies and blood. Thanksgiving is what I'd like to call a holiday of colonial historical revisionism. Historical revisionism is a reinterpretation of history, usually challenging orthodox and traditional views accepted by the majority. One can make the claim that any deviation from the origin story of Thanksgiving, at least from the colonist perspective, is in some way historical revisionism, and therefore not orthodox. In a way, this is true, but only if you believe what the majority believes. The drunken children's tale of pilgrims coming to what they called the New World to trade with natives and thus having a big feast may be considered orthodox or traditionally accepted if we look at Thanksgiving from the perspective of a colonist or a settler. However, this would only be accurate if the entire planet of Earth was only 1,000 years old. This would be true if we flat out ignore the stories told by the conquered and not the conquerors. If we are to apply an anarchist analysis of Thanksgiving, then what are some questions we can begin to ask while we dissect the legacy of the origin story of Thanksgiving and how it applies to mainstream culture in the U.S. empire today? According to the lore, pilgrims came from all sectors of Europe, landed on what is now known as Virginia, and had a religious ceremony with the natives who 100% consented and was met with no resistance at all whatsoever, and none of the natives died, and the story is totally accurate because America, and America is great, and America makes you free.
It was just the opposite. The whole hemisphere was actually ancient in terms of cultural development and population. Migrations there, unlike the theory of the Bering Strait and of the wandering Neolithic. That's mainly from North America, that settler colonialism wanting to make the native disappear. His name was Pratt, General Pratt. He said, let's teach them English and cut. So he has their hair cut off, puts them in army uniform, drills them all the time, and then gets some of the teachers from the colony there, the settlement, civilian settlement there, some of the teachers to come in and teach them English, and some of others to encourage their artwork. And then he starts, they get so adjusted, they're completely separated from their families and all. And they're told that they can be better off, than being these savages that they were. And so it's just kind of a brainwashing.
Do you ever stop to smell the roses and your nose catches a whiff of the stink of double standard? Well, that's what the U.S. empire was literally built on. Look at the foreign policies of the U.S. empire. Observe how the U.S. empire identifies certain immigrants as illegal, implying that there is a legal process. Given that so many immigrants migrate to the U.S. empire because their homes were destroyed by centuries of U.S. imperialist intervention, we can rationally conclude that immigrants cross the border because they have nowhere else to go, especially when they are coerced to move. It's also important to remember that a lot of immigrants and immigrant activists didn't cross the border, but rather the border that was arbitrarily drawn by colonists should be understood as something that has crossed them. To imply that immigrants are crossing some border that they shouldn't be crossing is implying that they are invading something. And it is a racist double standard to uphold this kind of mentality explicitly for immigrants. Because if immigrants from the southern border are the ones who are invading our country in the United States, then what does that make Europeans who invaded Turtle Island? Was that not an invasion? Was our invasion on Turtle Island somehow acceptable because we used violence, that we used gunpowder, that we used pseudo-scientific racism to justify our violence? I don't fucking think so, buddy. If your racist uncle is listening, tell him to calm his fucking titties. He'll get his mashed potatoes in a second. Immigrants often come to the US for cheap labor, which they are often shoehorned into extremely unsafe working conditions and an income below minimum wage. This is largely because immigrants tend to take odd jobs that US citizens wouldn't be damned to take because you're literally getting screwed over in that situation. Not to mention that immigration laws were created originally because of the migration of Jewish anarchists who suffered from the pogrom in Eastern Europe during the 19th and early 20th centuries. I said pogrom, not pilgrims. A pogrom is a riot with the intent of killing Jewish people. Also, it should be noted that most Eastern European Jewish immigrants became anarchists after the migration to the US. Keir Zimmerman, PhD, writes, utilizing anarchist publication, government surveillance files, and archival material, it focuses on Eastern European Jews and Italians, the two largest segments of the anarchist movement by the turn of the 20th century, and the development of anarchism among these groups in three important centers of American anarchism: New York's Lower East Side, Paterson, New Jersey, and San Francisco. It then follows the changing fortunes of the movement in the face of war, the Russian Revolution, the First Red Scare, and the birth of communism and fascism, and ends with the examination of immigrant American anarchist participation in the Spanish Civil War in 1936 and 1939. And that conflicts dramatic impact on the movement in the United States. This means that the U.S. empire has a very specific hatred of Jews. And let me just reiterate that when I say U.S. empire, I am not saying individual people, though that is largely true, and that's a problem. I am referring to the state as an apparatus and an organ of class rule. And thus, what led Jews to become anarchists at this time were not European conditions, but were conditions laid on them by the U.S. empire. So we can also understand why Jewish immigrants shipped over to the US in hope of seeking a safer home, but for Eastern European Jews, they did not find that safer home. So much for the land of opportunity, would you say, Emma Goldman? But now, let us imagine that context being paired with settler colonialism. Let's break this down a bit. A settler is a person who moves with a group to live somewhere else, such as a new country or new land. This has often been confused with the concept of a refugee. Refugees are not settlers. A refugee is someone who moves to another area but is displaced from the previous area. Refugees are not moving to another place because they choose to. They are doing so because they have to, because they are coerced to do so. Refugees tend to migrate for different reasons, such as climate change, military imperialist intervention by a richer nation, or many richer nations, who knows? Sometimes that richer nation is bombing the fuck out of that country all the time, every day, and they're gonna do it and they're not gonna stop until we do something about it. Other times, that same richer nation focuses heavily on expropriating the resources and destabilizing democracy and their governments of the smaller countries in which refugees flee from. Settlers are not refugees. I want to make that extremely clear. It takes completely different conditions for one to be a refugee than a settler. Colonialism, on the other hand, is taking control of a land, whether through legislation or by coercion. You know, typically to bring settlers in for exploitation. You know, like settler colonialism. But what is settler colonialism then? Settler colonialism is a type of colonialism where indigenous peoples from an area are displaced by settlers. You can also say that indigenous peoples are refugees in this case, since they are displaced and forced to move. And lastly, what is an indigenous person? An indigenous person is someone who originates from an area naturally and are thus native. So now we've defined all the terms we will be using for this section. I know it was a lot, but in order for me to continue, I need you all to be on the same page as I am, especially when I'm using specific terminology. If you're watching this at your family Thanksgiving dinner and your Uncle Mike is throwing a temper tantrum because you haven't passed the fucking gravy yet, then maybe, since he's asking for it, you should just throw it in his face while it's still hot. After all, you don't want it to get cold, right? I mean, that would be inconsiderate. Anyway, in the US empire, refugees are often labeled as immigrants or even illegal immigrants. Sometimes refugees are given asylum status, but this does not ensure their safety in the borders of the empire. Settlers, on the other hand, do not have to worry about this. In that sense, we are privileged. US Immigration and Customs Border Patrol is goddamn fucked up, and it takes a long time to get approved as a US citizen. Having a standing in the process to gain legal citizenship in the United States does not grant you any kind of safety from ICE. And that's fucked up. That's dangerous. And holy shit, have you seen the fucking detention centers lately? It's even worse than it was before. And I'm not gonna buy that Joe Biden made it better because now there's social distancing. Or even that they made it better by making some for children now. Like, which is, what the fuck? What kind of reasoning is that? And it is in this moment where we begin to observe a class divide that maintains a consistent stink of blood on our very soil.
Thank you, Sarah Miller. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen. Your hair is the color of the sun. Your skin is like fresh milk. And everyone loves you. Stop! Sit! Wait. What? We cannot break bread with you. Huh? Becky, what's going on? Wednesday! You have taken the land which is rightfully ours. Years from now, my people will be forced to live in mobile homes, on reservations. Your people will wear cardigans and drink highballs. We will sell our bracelets by the roadsides. You will play golf and enjoy hot hors d'oeuvres. My people will have pain and degradation. Your people will have stick shifts. The gods of my tribe have spoken. They have said, do not trust the pilgrims. Especially Sarah Miller.
Gary, she's changing the words.
According to a report called The Native Population of the Americas in 1492, scholars have estimated the indigenous population to be more than 112 million before colonial invasion. By the year 1650, the native population would eventually decline to be less than 6 million. Think about that. At that point in time, there were less indigenous people in what they call Turtle Island by 1962. less than the amount of people killed in the Nazi Holocaust. Don't you dare say Godwin's Law in the comments section. We're gonna get to that in a few minutes. Just you fucking wait. Now, I do think it's important to remember that colonialism didn't just happen in a single event or a single place and never ended at this point in history. You see, Thanksgiving is considered to have taken place in 1621, which most people don't bother to do the further reading, to which they conclude that was the first voyage to the Western Hemisphere. In 1492, Christopher Columbus wasn't even the first person to arrive in the Americas, but he was the one who did the bidding of the King and Queen of Spain. For his plundering, he would allot 10% of the profits he made for being the father of the Atlantic slave trade and the genocide of indigenous peoples. You see, upon encountering the Arawak in what we now call the Bahamas, Columbus wrote in his personal journal the following statement, quote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." I would like to remind my audience that this is a man we celebrate on a mainstream level. Of course, today, there is a movement to recognize the day that we celebrate Christopher Columbus as Indigenous Peoples Day instead. However, this does not address the fact that the true nature of Christopher Columbus' character is completely mythologized in today's American culture. Some people argue that Christopher Columbus was just doing his job, and therefore his actions does not make him a bad person. First of all, fuck you, because by that logic, every Nazi soldier was just doing their job, and they're not bad people because they were just doing their job, ordered by the Chancellor. Seriously, fuck you. Secondly, we need to keep in mind that his job was to justify to the King and Queen of Spain a profit motive for his voyages and expansion of trading African slaves and the genocide of indigenous peoples. He literally wrote that statement as a sales pitch to the King and Queen of Spain. This means, by this logic, that the word of the Spanish Inquisition and the ordainment of the God that is attached to the Spanish Inquisition holds more value to the average American citizen than the lives of African and Native American peoples. If the King and Queen of Spain hold value because they are ordained by royalty or the weaponization of the Christian God, then what does that say about the average everyday colonist's view of the lives of the Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere? Before we continue, I want to make a quick note by saying that when we analyze colonialism and its effect of it, it's important to look inward first and foremost. A lot of us, especially those with European ancestry, are heavily programmed by colonial programming. An example of colonial programming is the normalization of the mythology that claims Christopher Columbus discovered America. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. He was not the first person in the Americas. This drunken myth is not only false, but it robs our understanding of indigenous peoples from their personhood. The myth even perpetuates the violence that still occurs today towards indigenous peoples. This shit right here is a form of brainwashing. So then, when was the original Thanksgiving, and what was that even about? Well, the original date of Thanksgiving is largely debated, where a plethora of global locales still claim they hold the title for the first Thanksgiving. In fact, many countries besides the US celebrate Thanksgiving, including Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Grenada, Japan, Liberia, the Netherlands, the Philippines, Rwanda, St. Lucia, and the United Kingdom. These countries have different reasons for celebrating Thanksgiving. They also celebrate it in different ways from each other. In addition, they celebrate Thanksgiving on different days of the year from each other. There are even cultures that claim Thanksgiving predates Plymouth. Even back then, when settlers first started celebrating Thanksgiving, they didn't have turkey. They actually celebrated it eating all kinds of things such as corn and deer stock. With this said, we can conclude that Thanksgiving and its origin story is still hotly debated among the cultures surrounding the holiday. For this video, we will be focusing on Thanksgiving specifically in the US Empire, which is celebrated on the 4th Thursday of November. In popular fiction, the legend of Thanksgiving is mythologized to have taken place in 1621, but settlers of the day would have considered their first Thanksgiving to have officially taken place in their 1623 Day of Prayer. At this point, Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop used a charm-effective tactic to attempt to maintain diplomatic relations with the local indigenous populations. And I say charm-effective not to humanize John Winthrop, but to highlight his rather manipulative relationship with the local indigenous population. John Winthrop believed in this really fucky weird thing called vacuum domicilium, which basically is Latin for nobody's land. The principle here is that if the natives are using the land only seasonally for harvest and trapping, then the land was for the colonists to take. This ideology is flawed and disingenuous and dishonest. If the assumption is true that the land is being used seasonally by the indigenous peoples, then that means they're still using it, just not at the same time you are. What makes this specifically colonial is the commodification of this said land, converting it into private property. Not to mention that indigenous peoples have a different relationship with the land and the water than Europeans do and did. Private property is the private ownership of a property, the opposite of a publicly owned property. This means John Winthrop wanted to steal the land for himself and used a baseless fucking argument. A baseless argument and assumption that the land was theirs for the taking and the local natives would be complicit. To the natives, land and water is ecological and self-replenishing. They cultivate the land for their society to function. In places like the West Coast in the US, indigenous peoples use controlled burning to burn as little of the forest as possible, but only parts of the forest necessary for cultivating crop and self-replenishing resources. To them, the land and water is spiritual and a necessity for human and animal survival in this part of the world. Indigenous people have been doing this for longer than the US Empire's own lifespan. Indigenous people have a different and honestly better relationship with land than Europeans do. With this understanding, we can conclude that not only is private property an act of theft, but also colonialism is a form of coercion and violence. So inevitably, what followed was the Pequot War, in part incited by John Winthrop himself. This was an armed conflict between natives and colonizers. This war lasted from 1636 to 1638. By the end of this war, 700 Pequots were either killed or held captive by colonizers. In truth, the sad reality is that while this is the story remembered by indigenous nations on the stolen land the US Empire inhabits, this was not the end of the violence, and it wasn't even the first. The sheer number of massacres incited against Native Americans by colonizers is far too many to list in a single video. I also don't have the spoons or the mental capacity to cite every single one, which in itself is a testament to just how many indigenous nations have been gravely affected by colonial violence. I think it's also important to remember that the US Empire isn't the only empire committing this continued genocide. Canada is also largely complicit in all of this. Canada is not only the home of the residential school system, though the US has also adopted this as well, but we are currently discovering graves of indigenous children all across Canadian churches and residential schools. Residential schools were designed for the sake of enforcing assimilation. Assimilation is the process of adopting a whole new list of ideas and cultural beliefs. In the case of Indigenous children, assimilation was used by the state on them forcefully to integrate them into a so-called white culture. This doesn't get said enough, but assimilation is a form of genocide. I think sometimes people singularly pair the word genocide with mass killings, which it totally is. But assimilation, especially in the context of residential schools, is a form of genocide. It is a form of cultural erasure. With this understanding, we can also conclude that other forms of oppression that maintain a trend of assimilation can be considered as a form of genocide, such as heteronormativity. Also, in recent news, Indigenous women have been mysteriously going missing. You would think that with law enforcement let's go Brandoning their way to getting Kyle Rittenhouse free and all that shit, would use reciprocal energy and effort to finding these lost Indigenous women. But alas, they've proven again to be absolutely useless in finding these women who are mysteriously vanishing without a trace. To this very day, Indigenous nations face threats from state and federal government intervention on a large scale. When the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, granting all citizens the right to vote regardless of race, Native Americans were still not considered U.S. citizens and thus could still not vote. It wasn't until the passing of the Snyder Act in 1924 where they were able to finally have the right to vote. Holy shit. Native Americans have the highest rate of poverty in the world among any racialized group. As the U.S. suicide rate has increased in the last 20 years between 1999 and 2019, Native Americans between men and women that were surveyed and recorded commit 139% and 71% more suicide in those 20 years respectively. Holy shit! In the last decade even, we've seen several capitalist interventions on native reservations that were granted legal treaties and lawful protection from colonial invasion. I guess that fucking didn't work out after all. These capitalists mainly seek to build pipelines that intersect the reservations regardless of said treaty. Personally, I remember the confrontation of Dakota Access Pipeline on Standing Rock like it was yesterday. The conflict was extremely unjustified from my perspective and plainly, obviously, not reciprocal. These were people, unarmed protesters, protecting their water source, their fucking river. These energy companies wanted to drill a pipeline in a fucking river. It is already bad that Nestle sees water as something that should not be a basic human right to have access to. But these motherfuckers, they sent military-graded police armed to the goddamn teeth with sonic weapons designed to destroy eardrums, tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, drone weapons, and so many inventive ways to harm peaceful protesters for the sake of claiming land that did not belong to the U.S. empire. Meanwhile, Barack Obama is sitting on his fucking hands, and Donald Trump, when he became president, decided to capitalize on it immediately on day one. Thanks, Obama. Fuck off. I remember hearing at one point the company behind Dakota Access Pipeline wanted to redirect the pipeline because there was an immense pressure from the protesters as well as the rest of the fucking world. But when that happened, they aimed it at a rich neighborhood full of white people who also said, "Not in my backyard." And thus the executives went back to plan A, literally redirecting once again the pipeline towards the reservation. I literally lost my fucking temper while I was at work that day. You wouldn't believe it. I remember thinking to myself, my boss is a racist piece of shit, and I could absolutely find the energy within me to slug him if I wasn't living on a fucking wage. And if I could, I would take my car, use all of the gas money to fucking book it to Standing Rock to fucking be a part of this. Cause it was legitimately making me fucking angry. Though I decided against not going. Mainly because there was a large report of people showing up there, mainly hipsters and liberals and really bougie fucking people that are reactionary, kind of wanting to be like a white savior, like the hero of the day. And they even started sending people back. So I decided against it because I found out that there are other ways to support that cause. But there's also the Keystone XL pipeline, which is a multinational pipeline between Canada and the US. They're even trying to build a pipeline in the Northeast, even going as far as to attempt to drill the fucking pipeline in the Penobscot River, a sacred river to the Penobscot Nation. And let us not forget the Unistoten Camp, which is a protest camp fighting against another fucking pipeline. The police, being the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, won't even let them fucking bless the water. Let me repeat, the fucking police won't even let the people of this reservation bless the goddamn water. I hope what people take away from all of this is the necessity to abolish the colonial empires that continue to invade, marginalize, and colonize peoples across the world. And that's not just the US empire. Anti-colonial struggle is a global struggle on a large diaspora for liberation of all peoples. Palestinian liberation is an example of anti-colonial action, as much as it is here in the US and elsewhere. I want to remind people that the struggle for indigenous rights is a struggle for human rights. The struggle for indigenous liberation is a struggle for human liberation. And the struggle for indigenous resistance is a struggle to resist against colonialism. Here are some thoughts on that. Number one, please take the time to actually educate yourself. I strongly urge that this video should be a launch pad for further curiosity and education, and not a primary resource. I'd be hard pressed to call this a secondary resource, but I guess it kinda is, because it's a retelling of a primary account. But please, if you're going to start learning about indigenous resistance and liberation, please seek the perspective of an indigenous person. And keep in mind also that indigenous people are not a monolith, not just within your own continent, but throughout the whole world. And on that front, indigenous nations, they don't agree with each other on absolutely everything. For instance, when you hear about black nationalism, self-determination, decolonization, and land back, each nation has different views on these subjects, and how they can be approached is not seen exactly the same from people to people. Even within their own nations, they see things differently than each other, and that's okay. And I would also recommend that if you start inquiring about this, to not make accusations or assumptions. In fact, you should be in the position of wanting to learn and wanting to aid and show solidarity for indigenous people. It's so often where white people will try to conflate black nationalism or land back to something as not that as white nationalism or a white ethno-state. What the fuck are you guys thinking? And keep in mind as well, all of this is pretty much what I have learned in my time speaking with indigenous peoples, but this is still my settler perspective, meaning you should not take my word as gospel. You should seek to learn from other indigenous and native peoples, and not just my take. Number two, you should engage in anti-colonial action. These actions range from various forms of praxis, including toppling down the statue of a colonist clown or a Confederate ass fuck McGee. These statues that are being taken down in the last few years serve the role of normalizing U.S. violence on marginalized and colonized people. Like, you know that Robert E. Lee statue that there was a fucking shit show in Charlottesville about? Well, he was a Confederate general who fought for quote-unquote states' rights. And in case you're uninitiated, states' rights is a dog whistle, a code word if you will, for the right to own and trade slaves. Please be aware of this when you see white nationalists rally to defend these statues, or when they wave the Confederate flag or the Blue Lives Matter flag or the Proud Boys or whatever. When they affiliate with white nationalist and racist ideology, you need to be keen on this shit. And you need to be there to resist that bullshit safely, because they're not defending heritage, because said heritage is baseless. If they identify the Confederacy as their heritage, and if their heritage benefited from an economy functioning on slave trade and slave labor, then their heritage was founded on and is holistically about slave labor. And it falls fucking flat. For transparency, my dead name was chosen for me based on a Confederate general, which, with all things considered, is a pretty fucking good incentive for me to fucking change it. And thank God I did. Number 3, it's not only important to resist pipeline construction and the continued police violence that we see in our lives, it's important to be constructive and restorative with your practices. Mutual aid drives and fundraisers are super helpful for those in dire need on those reservations. You can actually save people's lives by donating to these. But this also involves fighting to defund and abolish the police and prison industrial complexes for the sake of funding programs that will actually help your community restore and heal in a more effective way than Officer Turpin's Call of Duty fetishes. But what's also important is restructuring our education about this nation. Children do need to learn about critical race theory in school. I'm going to repeat that for those in the back. Critical race theory is mandatory. I don't care how tight your Klan robe is on you. Go fuck yourself. Because those who oppose the teaching of critical race theory are also the same people who don't want you to know about all of this colonial violence in the first place. They want you to remain silent and complicit with the cultural violence that we see in the U.S. empire. But I'm not a teacher. I'm an educator and an agitator. That's all I do. I'm not qualified to be teaching on this subject. But that is more of an incentive for it to be taught in school and not taught by someone on YouTube. There is the 1619 Project, which I will admit, it's not perfect, but it is a fantastic beginning step towards this goal, and it's absolutely worth fighting for. And number 4, what do you do at the dinner table? Honestly, if you're one of those people who argue that Thanksgiving is about celebrating togetherness and family, then I shall call bullshit. There are 365 days in a calendar year. You can gather your family on any other day of the year. In fact, every day should be about family, friendship, love, compassion, sharing, and camaraderie. And if you want to talk about being thankful, why don't you ask indigenous people what being thankful means to them? And if your argument is that you just want a big ass fucking dinner, then by all means, go ahead and eat. Gorge. I hope you have a fantastic dinner tonight. And I genuinely mean that, with no sarcasm attached. But please remember that you can also do this whenever you want. I know Thanksgiving is when everyone has day off, but truth be told, having the day off on the fourth Thursday of November every year isn't a justification for the normalization and downplaying of state-funded genocide. And once again, I urge you to throw that fucking gravy at your cop uncle while it's still piping hot. He's getting furious over there, so don't keep that bastard waiting. Think of it like this. He'll like the gravy so much that he'll have to take the day off from patrolling and committing acts of state violence tomorrow. Of course, this is all in a video game. Now make me proud and do good things for a better future. Thank you.